Good day. Most of today's program is going to be devoted to the meeting in the Kremlin where President Putin of Russia signed the accession treaties which make the four regions of Ukraine, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics in Russian eyes now a part of Russia. However, as is traditional with these programs, I'm going to first of all discuss the military situation on the battlefronts specifically, and most precisely the situation in Krasny Liman. Now, I'm going to say straight away that the situation in Krasny Liman has been attracting an enormous amount of attention. I suspect a disproportionate amount of attention. It's distracting attention away from the fact, for example, that Ukraine's much vaunted and much spoken about counteroffensive in Kherson region has been an utter and complete debacle, one which has resulted in heavy loss of life. It also distracts attention from the fact that in the central Donbass, in Donetsk itself, we're getting ever more reports trickling in about more and more troops, more and more Wagner militia troops closing in ever tighter on the Ukrainian city of, on the important Donetsk city of Bakhmut, which is the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. Now, in order to get a sense of proportion, I think a few simple points can be made. Bakhmut city, before the war, was reckoned to have a population of around 70,000. If you combine it with all the surrounding towns and villages that make up the Bakhmut conurbation, you're talking about a metropolitan area of around 120,000 people. Liman had a pre-war population of around 15,000 and is now largely deserted. It is actually, so I understand it, a part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation and should be understood in those terms. Now, some of the discussions that I've seen about these battles, which are basically the battles around Liman, which are almost entirely originated from Russian bloggers and Russian reporting agencies like Rybar and War Gonzo, which, interestingly, are now being quoted extensively in Western media. Now, some of this reporting might lead you to think that we are talking about battles in and around Liman on the scale of Stalingrad or something like that. Well, I would just like, again, to give some sense of proportion here. It seems that the garrison of Liman, the fighters who have been defending Liman from the Ukrainian army, numbers around 500 men. And most of those, in fact, as I understand it, nearly all of them, are not Russian regular army. They come basically from two units, a unit of the Lugansk militia, which refers to itself as a Cossack unit, and another unit of Kuban Cossacks, who I believe are volunteers from Russia. Now, they have received a large amount of artillery support from the Russian military, to be precise, from the 20th Combined Arms Army, which is the army that has the main role for defenses around the Oskol River. But it seems that actual infantry of the 20th Combined Army of the Russian Federation are not physically present in Liman itself. So we're talking about a force of around 500 men. Now, it is up against a Ukrainian force whose numbers swell with each report. So I've read reports that it numbers 20,000, 30,000 men, 40,000 men. It seems a more realistic estimate is about 6,000 men. Now that gives the Ukrainians a very large superiority in numbers. It gives them an advantage of 12-1 against the Liman garrison. And it's actually an amazing accomplishment, in my opinion, and a striking achievement that this small force in Liman has been able to hold back this much bigger Ukrainian force for around 2 to 3 weeks, ever since the debacle in Kharkiv earlier in September. But again, it needs to be said clearly, this is a battle between two relatively small forces. A small force of irregular, but obviously highly brave, highly motivated, and well-disciplined infantry defending Liman, and a much larger Ukrainian force which has been struggling to take Liman now for 2 to 3 weeks and has up to this point failed to do so. So is this battle decisively important? Well, again, you might think that from some of the things you've been reading, and there's been suggestions that Liman is somehow a strategically important transport artery, that its fall would open the way for a Ukrainian advance to a supposedly even more important town called Svatovo, which is part of the hub of communications upon which the entire northern front of the Russian forces in Donbass depends. And this is now being spoken about regularly and repeatedly by these Russian bloggers and reporters, and it's been picked up by the Western media. Except that I don't believe it. And I'll give a simple reason why. Liman was captured by the Donbass militia in May. In other words, it had been under Ukrainian control up to that point. It fell, by the way, at around the same time that the battles around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk were heating up. Now, if Liman was so important for the entire Russian northern front, why is it important now? And why was it not important when the Ukrainians were in control of it? Now, I've read various commentaries here, and I regularly read these Russian bloggers, and I'm going to make a quick observation about them. I think they are extremely talented and honest and reliable reporters of actual events on the ground. Now, if we're talking about the fighting in Liman, it all seems to me that nearly all the reporting stems from two of these bloggers or reporting agencies. One is Riba, and the other is another one called War Gonzo. Strange name, but there we are. And they're obviously obtaining their information from a specific source in Liman. It might be 2 people or it might be 1 person. Who knows? But inevitably, their reporting is coloured by the opinions of that particular source, who obviously and understandably sees the whole battle in terms of the importance of Liman itself. And if you follow these Russian reporters and commentators, one can't avoid the sense sometimes that many of them believe that the war in Ukraine would have been won much more quickly if the Russian High Command had been listening to their advice. So they're very reliable, very good reporting agencies if you want to know what's going on in any particular location. But their judgment of the strategic importance of any particular battle is one that one should be careful before simply accepting. Now, that's my view. And I am going to say straight away and remind everybody I am not a military expert. Understanding strategy, tactics, battlefield operations, all that kind of thing is not my thing. But I have also read commentaries by other Russian bloggers, including this interesting man, Igor Girkin, formerly Strelkov, who was the leader for a long time of the Donbass militia back in 2014 and has now become a very influential blogger on the Russian side of the wall. Anyway, he has exactly the same view about the importance or relative unimportance of Liman that I have. In fact, Girkin's criticism is that Liman was defended at all. He thinks this place is so unimportant that it made no sense to leave this small garrison of 500 men there to go on fighting for as long as they have. And he's asking questions about why it wasn't evacuated sooner. Now, I'm going to offer my own view. I think that the point about Liman, the reason why this force was presumably ordered to hold ground in Liman, was because after the collapse in Kharkiv, after the Russians pulled out of Kharkiv region, out of the Izium-Balaklia area, they needed to hold certain points to prevent the Ukrainian offensive developing and turning into something really dangerous. And the garrison in Liman were therefore told to hold their ground until they obtained relief, and that is what they did, and they did very successfully by fighting on in Liman for as long as they have. They have prevented Ukraine from developing its Kharkiv offensive into something which might conceivably have been more serious in the area of northern Donbass. Now, I suspect that the value of that is now almost exhausted. I suspect that the Russians have now, by now, sorted out all their defenses in northern Donbass, and the latest reports say that there are now Russian forces from another army, the 58th Army, which, by the way, was the army which defeated Georgia in the short South Ossetian War of 2008. Anyway, there are forces of the 58th Army which apparently have now broken through to Liman and are supporting the garrison there. Now, it could be that the plan is to pull the troops, the garrison, out of Liman and abandon it to the Ukrainians, or it could be that the intention is to hold on to Liman until, well, and to push the Ukrainians back. I'm not going to make any guesses or speculations one way or the other. But I will say this, sometimes you should not judge a war by which battle is getting the most attention. Far and away, the most important battle which is being fought out now in Donbass is the one that is still being fought out in Bakhmut city, and where the Wagner Group and its allied forces have been making steady progress. The events in Liman, dramatic and exciting though they are, to me, in my inexpert way, have all the look of a sideshow. I suspect that this sideshow, as I said, is now running out of its importance. The Russian defences, as I said, in northern Donbass have almost certainly been built up. And besides, it seems that we're now only 2 or 3 weeks away from the autumn rains, which will turn all the ground soft and make any Ukrainian offensives in northern Donbass impractical anyway. So I suspect that this battle, one way or the other, is going to be ended and concluded fairly soon. The one thing that makes this battle important is not Liman itself and its supposed strategic importance. Again, I want to reiterate, this is very much my view. It is the obsession with which Ukraine has sought its capture. Back in the first weeks of September, after the Kharkiv offensive, it made complete sense for Ukraine to want to capture Liman, because at that point it was an obvious town in the way of any further Ukrainian advance into northern Donbass. But with the weeks, as the weeks have passed, and as the practical realities of a Ukrainian offensive in northern Donbass, so it seems to me, have dwindled away, it has become less and less obvious, at least to me, why Liman is being given this importance. And I can't help but think that the primary reason that the Ukrainians have been trying to capture Liman and throwing more and more troops into the attempt to capture Liman is because of the optics. They want to continue to give the impression that their offensive in Ukraine is successful, that it is continuing to gain ground. They captured Kharkiv region, which is largely uncontested territory, and that gave them a huge boost to their morale, but they have failed everywhere else, and the autumn rains are turning against them, and as we will see in a moment, the strategic situation is now turning against them too. So, before the end of what you might call the campaigning season in autumn, they have therefore sought to capture Liman, and they've diverted troops from perhaps more important areas of the front lines to try to achieve this. Earlier, it seems that they sent troops from Bakhmut city itself, as I said, much more important place, to try to capture Liman. And today, as of the time I'm making this program, there's been reports that they also sent part of the troops that were defending the other important part of the northern part of the Ukrainian defense lines, Siversk, on this quest to capture Liman as well. Now, to me, that looks like a mistaken approach. And in fact, there were reports earlier today that the Ukrainian General Staff gave orders that Liman must be encircled by the end of today at any cost. And we'll speak in a moment as to why that is. I actually think that the real order was that Liman must be captured by the end of today at any cost. And again, we'll speak as to why that is. And as I said, I think the primary purpose is that at a time when the strategic picture is now turning decisively against Ukraine, they need to support their morale and the morale of their Western backers by at least pointing to one other battlefield victory. Anyway, whether the Russians decide to make a stand at Liman, or whether they decide that now that it's done its job, the garrison there can be pulled back, or whether they will themselves launch some kind of offensive to clear Ukrainian troops further away from Liman, I'm not going to try and speculate at this moment. I mean, I simply don't know. The Russian High Command doesn't share its opinions about battles with me. The major thing to say about the situation on the battlefields is that, except for Liman itself, everywhere else, Ukraine's offensive has failed. And in Bakhmut city, it is the Russians who, in a real and material sense, continue with their offensive. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Liman. Anybody is fully entitled to disagree with me about this. They can each come to their own conclusions about this battle. But I would reiterate again that the one fact that seems to be incontrovertible and indisputable is that the garrison at Liman is 500 men, around 500 men, and that surely is a sign of its relative lack of importance. Now, let's talk about the really big events today, which was the meeting in the Kremlin, in the Georgievsky Hall of the Kremlin, one of the largest and most historic halls in the Kremlin. Putin was there. He gave a speech. The leaders of the four regions were there. There was a signing ceremony. The treaties of accession were signed between Putin and the leaders of these four regions. And as a result, presumably after a certain procedures are completed, by the end of the day, all these four regions will, in Russian eyes, will be in Russian eyes a part of the Russian Federation. I need hardly add, of course, that no part of the West will recognize this. No other country will, but then, of course, do they actually need to? I mean, states like Donetsk and Lugansk and Kherson and Zaporozhye, if they were to become independent states, would no doubt seek international recognition from other states. But once they become part of Russia, why do they need to? Why does a country like, say, Peru need to take an issue on this? They don't need to make a decision whether to recognize anything that's happened in this area of Ukraine, or what was once Ukraine, if you now treat them as part of Russia, because one way or the other, they have no cause to. They don't need to open embassies in the towns of these places. They don't need to open embassies in Donetsk and Lugansk and in Kherson and in whatever administrative center of Zaporozhye the Russians are administering Zaporozhye from. Berdyansk, perhaps, I don't know. But the fact is, they don't need to do anything. They can just sit on their hands, accept the situation, carry on as it is. They don't need to vote to decide whether or not these four regions should be included as states in the United Nations, because as of today, they are not states any longer. The inclusion of these four states into Russia, as of now, simplifies the diplomatic position. It makes it easier for the Russians than it might otherwise have done if these regions were no longer a part of Russia, were still not part of Russia, were independent states, were treated by the Russians as independent states. And moreover, I'm going to suggest it's also going to have another effect, and it's an effect which perhaps we should not underestimate, because if you are a Russian speaker in a place like Odessa or Kharkiv or Nikolaev or Zaporozhye city, or perhaps even other places like Dnipropetrovsk, if you like, you now know that if you take a stand against the Ukrainian government, and if the Russian military comes to where you are, and if it stays, well, you're not going to be handed back to Ukraine as part of a peace deal, because you stand an almost certain chance of making your territory part of Russia. And I would have thought that over time, this is going to have a significant effect. It's going to have a significant effect in places like Odessa and Zaporozhye and perhaps Kharkiv. People there will not need to think that they have to go through some complex transition stage like the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics did, maintaining a fiction that they're somehow independent states always with the possibility at the back of everybody's mind that they might be stuffed back into Ukraine. So I think this is actually, in terms of Ukraine's long-term future, a very consequential move, and we'll come back to Ukraine's response shortly. But anyway, it's important to say that though Putin's speech, which is the main event of this ceremony, the signing ceremony in the Kremlin, was of course focused on the inclusion of these 4 regions in the Russian Federation, it was not the main part of his speech. And his speech overall was actually quite extraordinary, and in some ways marked a significant departure from speeches that Putin has made in the past. The first point to make is that Putin, over the course of his speech, for the first time that I'm aware of, clearly differentiated Russia from Europe. Now, this is an important point to make because up to this point, Putin and other Russian leaders have insisted that Russia is an integral part of Europe. But what Putin did was this. He said that the Western powers, he specifically and principally talked about the English-speaking powers, the United States, Britain, he mentioned France too, have a imperialist, colonialist mentality. And that they have sought at various points in history since the late Middle Ages to expand their power across the world in order to achieve global dominance, but also in order to enrich themselves at the expense of those countries, those nations, those civilizations which they had subjugated. And very strikingly, Putin said that this was the fate earmarked for Russia itself. Russia avoided becoming a colony of the European powers because of its success in the 16th and 17th centuries in creating its own centralized and powerful state. And that meant that Russia was able to withstand this Western colonial aggression. And he said that this continued right up until the 1980s, when, as a result of processes which we all know, the Soviet Union collapsed, and for a certain period of time in the 1990s, Russia did become a colony of the Western powers, by this time, of course, led by the United States. And Putin said that all the same processes that played out in the other colonies that the Europeans and the West managed to capture. He talked about India, China. China never quite became a colony, but was a kind of semi-colony at one point. Africa, all of these places, he spoke about how they were looted of their resources by the Western powers, and he said that the same thing was happening to Russia in the 1990s. Now, you may or may not agree with this history, but the point is that what Putin is doing here, and it is very, very interesting, is that he is telling Russians and he is telling the global South, don't think of Russia as a European power. We were never part of this globalist, global, colonialist, imperialist project. On the contrary, like you, we were one of its targets. We managed to a great extent and very successfully to defend ourselves for a long time. We briefly succumbed in the 1990s, but we are resisting again. So what that does is it tells countries like China, India, the African states, the nations of the Middle East, other Asian states, the states of Latin America, we are more like you than we are like the United States and the rest of the West. We are victims of the same type of colonial aggression that you have been. We identify with you, so you can identify with us. And he made a very interesting comment. He spoke of Russia as a civilizational state, implying that Russia has its own distinctive civilization, which by definition must be different from that of Europe and the United States and the rest of the West. And of course he went into considerable detail, and here the West has given him an enormous amount of help. He went into considerable detail about how the West is now busy trying to cancel Russian culture, proving thereby that its Russian culture, civilization is distinct from that of the West. And he also, of course, went out of his way to talk about the social distinctions, the famous lifestyle issues. I have to be very careful what I say here, which make Russia different from the West, but make it much more like the global South. Now that is a very interesting point, because no Russian leader, certainly not since the time of Peter the Great, has talked in that way. No Russian leader up to this point has come out and said that Russia is distinct and different from the West in the way and to the extent that Putin has done. And that in itself is remarkable, especially given Putin's authority in Russia and the long stretch of time that he has been leader. But it's also, I suspect, a view which quite a lot of Russians now, perhaps even a critical mass of Russians, will share. Now, how long it will persist for the long term, that's another matter. Whether ultimately the Russians will say to themselves, well, hold on, despite all our problems with Europe, we are ultimately much more European than we are anything else. And whether they'll be drawn back to Europe one day again, I don't know. But for the moment, Russia has a leader who is repudiating, who is rejecting the West. It's important to stress that throughout the communist era, no Soviet leader ever spoke in this way. Lenin, who was the first leader of the Soviet Union, he conceived of the USSR, Russia, as a force that would spread the workers' revolution throughout the West, and which was the vanguard of the proletariat, the working class, including and perhaps even especially in Europe. Joseph Stalin not only thought in similar ways, but during the Second World War, if you read his wartime speeches, he clearly spoke about the Soviet Union's mission to liberate the rest of Europe from the German plague. Of course, he spoke a lot about the ideology of that period, which I don't want to refer to, again, for various reasons. But if you read his speeches at that time, he clearly still conceived of the Soviet Union as belonging to a cultural world that included the West. And of course, subsequent Soviet leaders, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, all the rest, well, obviously, they saw the Soviet Union as having a distinct identity and personality, but they too never thought of the Soviet Union in the kind of distinct, non-Western, civilizational terms that Putin is now talking about. And I think this is something which has momentous implications. It means that, in effect, and for the time being, the West has lost Russia. So that has big implications because, of course, Russia, as Putin was at pains to say, is a country with tremendous resources. And the fact that the West is not able to rely on those resources is going to weaken the West in the long term as it pitches itself in competition with the other rising powers. And here I would add that Putin made some really very interesting points, and his economic history here is not wholly wrong, by the way. He points out that in the 1980s, even as the Soviet Union was breaking down, the West was actually in the grip of a very real economic crisis. And he's right, actually. There were moments when things got better and got worse. There was a period of brief revival in the mid-1980s as a result of certain supply-side reforms which were carried out by Ronald Reagan's administration in the United States. There's a big open question mark over how sustainable that recovery was. But Putin said that in his speech that the only way that the Western powers were able to resolve the problems, the economic problems that had struck them at the end of the 70s and in the 1980s was during the 1990s by gaining control and extracting Russian resources. And there's some truth to this. You could argue, in fact, I would argue, that one of the reasons we are in an inflation crisis today, just as we were in the West in an inflation crisis in the 1970s and early 1980s, was partly because there is a major resource problem, especially in energy problems and food problems and all those sort of things, supply side problems. Living standards are in excess now of what resources can supply. And the result is that we have had to pull in resources from other places. And in the 1990s, we got over that inflation problem that we had, in part by benefiting from Russian natural resources. And I would add, by the way, cheap Chinese manufactured goods. And that one of the reasons why inflation has come back now is because Russian resources are no longer available to the same degree, and obviously the flow of cheap goods from China, well, there's a question mark over that as well. So, his history, you could perhaps argue with it. I don't think it is completely one to be dismissed. And he suggested, again, that one of the major reasons why the West today is so aggressive towards Russia is, again, because the Western powers want to solve their current very profound economic problems more profound than those they faced in the 1970s and early 1980s, again by gaining control of Russia's resources. So Putin, in effect, describes a predatory West anxious to gain control of Russian resources in order to enrich itself at Russia's expense And of course, he links that to the practice, the Western practice of colonial extraction during the period of the colonial empires that the Europeans constructed. It's a powerful image. And again, you can argue with its details. You might argue with the entire concept. But I can imagine that it will gain traction amongst a lot of Russians, and perhaps also, in fact, almost certainly also, in the global south as well, and in places like India and China too. So, quite an interesting speech, quite a powerful speech in its way, delivered, as always with Putin, with less than rhetorical mastery. He's not a natural orator. His speeches always read more interesting than his delivery might imply, but one which, as I said, will certainly gain a lot of traction in the West, in Russia and in the global south, even as it is going to annoy and exasperate the West. And I'm going to add just one final twist to this speech, because one other thing he did, which I am sure is going to infuriate the West, especially Western leaders especially, is that he now also spoke about the West as it senses its loss of position, as its resource base begins to fall, that the West is now becoming predatory towards itself. The different parts of the West are now feeding off each other. And he spoke of the United States taking a predatory approach towards Europe, and he was scathing about the weakness, the pusillanimity of European leaders as they allow themselves, as they allow their continent, as they allow Europe to be immiserated, essentially for American benefit. And in order to twist the knife, he straight out alleged, before any investigation has taken place, by the way, but he straight out alleged that it was the Anglo-Saxons, in other words, the United States and Britain, who had carried out the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. That must, by the way, have been a very late admission to his speech, inclusion in his speech. So, quite a powerful speech by Putin. But let's move away from these grand issues that Putin is very skilled at weaving together, and which we will, which may indeed have powerful traction in the future. And let's talk about the immediate consequence of what Putin, of what the Russians have done. These 4 regions are now legally a part of Russia. Putin said to Ukraine, right, this is your chance. You agree a ceasefire, pull your troops out of these 4 regions. And if you don't, then you will have to face the fact that we in Russia will consider that you're committing aggression against us by occupying part of what we now consider to be our territory. And Putin, very interestingly, spoke about Russia being prepared to use all available means to defend its territory. Now, all available means, of course, includes nuclear weapons. I don't think he was threatening Ukraine with nuclear weapons. I think he was basically telling the West that if the West decides now to intervene in this war, then the Russians have nuclear weapons, and they would not be shy from using them if the West, by intervening, threatened Russian territory. So this is quite a powerful warning, but of course Putin did combine it with an offer for negotiations. One can't possibly say what negotiations those were, what these negotiations would be about now. He has previously talked about demilitarization and neutrality and the purging of a particular ideology from Ukraine. I have to say, I can't really understand how that would be sufficient in itself to form the basis of any negotiation, because he made it very clear that as of this moment, the status of Donbass and of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions as part of Russia is now no longer open to discussion. So what does that mean? Well, it is all but inconceivable. It is in fact inconceivable that Ukraine will accept this. They will continue the war. And the very latest reports I'm hearing is that they're actually now pulling troops from other parts of the front line, from the southern regions, to try to hold back the Russian reinforcements in Krasny Liman, and doing all sorts of things of this kind. Well, what I can't help but think is going to happen now is that we're going to move rapidly from a special military operation into a situation of what would amount to all-out war. Now, I say all-out war. I don't know that the Russians are going to give themselves an open-ended geographical area. I'm not suggesting that they're necessarily planning to occupy Kiev or capture Lviv or any of those sort of things. But it seems to me that from this moment on, it won't be just a expeditionary force, a Russian expeditionary force operating in Ukraine that the Ukrainians have to deal with, an expeditionary force that only accounts for a relatively small part of the Russian armed forces. As of this time, from this moment on, it will be the entirety of Russia's armed forces. Well, maybe not its entirety, but a major part of it, as the Russians move to defend what they will no doubt see as their own territory. And I don't see how Ukraine can resist that. The Ukrainians apparently are now asking for urgent admission into NATO. I can't imagine that will happen, as that would lead NATO into a direct war with Russia, which NATO powers absolutely do not want. The flow of weapons from the West to Ukraine appears to have come essentially to a stop. Now, in a recent video, I discussed the latest Pentagon arms package for Ukraine and the fact that the United States, the Pentagon, had announced that Ukraine was to receive a further 18 HIMARS launchers on top of the 16 that had already been provided. Now, what I didn't understand is that these HIMARS launchers, these 18 HIMARS launchers, don't yet exist. They have to be built. So, in effect, what's happening is that the Pentagon is now making an order for more HIMARS launch vehicles and more HIMARS rockets to be built by the military-industrial complex so that they can be supplied to Ukraine in 2 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, who knows? Certainly not now. Ukraine received a large amount of weaponry from the West in the early summer, and that was the weaponry which was used, which was used by Ukraine in its recent offensives. If you look at Ukrainian tanks, they are almost entirely, as far as I can see, the tanks Ukraine is using now are no longer the old Ukrainian T-64s, which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union. They are old Soviet T-72s, which were supplied to Ukraine from the former Warsaw Pact countries that are now members of NATO. And Ukraine also received M113 armoured personnel carriers, which are now their main armoured personnel carriers, and they received artillery, M777 howitzers, some self-propelled guns, and of course HIMARS systems and a number of old Soviet fighter jets from places like Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria. And those were the weapons with which Ukraine has waged these latest offensives. Except that it seems they burnt through a large part of those. I've seen some suggestions that they've run through something like 60% of their tanks, around a third of their armoured personnel carriers. And those armoured personnel carriers, by general consensus, are not very effective anyway in this particular battlefield. And if you believe Russian reports, large numbers of M777 howitzers have been destroyed, and large numbers of HIMARS missile launchers have also been destroyed. So Ukraine is running out of weapons. Again, it was saved from disaster in late summer by this flow of Western weapon systems. That has now run its course. There don't seem to be any Western weapon systems that can be supplied anytime soon. And so Ukraine is again going to suffer a weapons and ammunition deficit before long. And of course, as we all know, Ukraine went through 7 stages of mobilization. But it's beginning to look as if the manpower pool has also been exhausted, that the Ukrainian army was brought up to a size of 400,000 men at the start of September, heavily outnumbering the combined Russian and militia forces in Ukraine. But Ukrainian officials have said that there's no plan for any further mobilizations, probably, as I said, because the manpower pool is exhausted. So a Ukrainian army that has spent itself on the offensives that it has conducted over the course of September is now pitched against a Russia, which now considers these territories, these 4 territories, to be part of its own territory, and which gives every indication of being about to escalate its war and to deploy hundreds of thousands of men to the war in Ukraine. That, after all, is presumably what the partial mobilization is all about. What does Ukraine do? Well, I'm going to say what I think. I think Ukraine should have agreed to those negotiations, pressed on with those negotiations, with that deal it had almost agreed with Russia on the 29th of March. There's no return to that, unfortunately, now. At that time, the Russians were prepared to accept that Ukraine would get Kherson and Zaporozhye back, and that Ukraine would only lose Donbass as well as Crimea. Now Ukraine has to lose more territory. And on top of all of that, it seems to me that Ukraine lost another possible chance to negotiate, which was in the immediate aftermath of the Kharkiv offensive. At that point, if President Zelensky and his officials had come forward and said, we're prepared to sit down to talk, we've achieved a victory, well, the Russians would have agreed, because they've always said that they're prepared to talk, and perhaps something might have been agreed then. But now, what do the Ukrainians do? Well, I don't know what they do. I still think they should sit down and talk. It seems to me that if they refuse to do so, before long they will lose more territory. Perhaps in 3 months' time, 4 months' time, 6 months' time, they will have lost Kharkiv and Odessa as well. The Russians will be on the Dnieper. And then Ukraine's position will become worse still. Ukraine is putting itself in a worse position because it has relied upon Western promises, and it has thrown away opportunities for peace. What I will say is this: continuing with the war now, whatever disadvantages peace might entertain, the only thing it's certain to do is result in many, many more Ukrainian lives being lost. I cannot see what is gained by that. It seems to me that Ukraine, on the contrary, needs to sit down and seek peace. And if that means a much smaller, more truncated Ukraine, well, we are where we are. I have to say this again. I'm not somebody who ever likes regime change operations or anything of that kind, but I'm becoming increasingly doubtful that these negotiations can be carried through by President Zelensky. It seems to me that he's now far too compromised to be able to do that. And perhaps Ukraine, those people who want to preserve something of Ukraine, ought to be thinking now about changing their leader. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say. A momentous day, a vitally important day, a day that will live in history. Obviously, many more developments soon. I will keep you informed. We'll see what happens on the Krasny Liman front and how the battle there goes. I don't personally think it's going to change anything in the overall direction of the war. But anyway, that's me for the day. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, especially Locals, where I did an extremely successful live stream on Wednesday. Lots of people came and asked questions, and if you want to join and ask me directly questions, the live stream on Locals would be a good place to do it. All you need to do is subscribe to our channel on Locals, find the link under this video, and you can join that live stream on Wednesday. And of course, you can also find us on other platforms: Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, and Telegram. And don't forget that if you want to support us, that you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying the amazing things that you will find there: our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.